asked to moderate today's event. And I shall do so. Thank you very much for coming over. You are all welcome to this important event. We gonna start and maybe ensure that by 3:30 we're done this part of the occasion, and then we go into the next part, which is the exhibition itself. I thought maybe before I start, just to get a context of what it is that we're about here, the book launch, exhibition, etc. But to borrow from Professor Vishwas Satgar, and quoting, climate change is the most serious challenge we face today. Despite numerous warnings from scientific studies, UN declarations, books, movies, and progressive media reporting, global leadership has failed humanity. So there is apparently no solution. Instead, we have continued emitting pollutants and extensively using fossil fuels. As a result, I've been recording the hottest years on the planet, post-COVID. So that's the context of why we're here today. So that we go through the book, we will see that the discussions, the exhibition itself is going to explain it, and it's aptly called it Facing the Heat in South Africa. I thought just to create another context, because this is a different storytelling method, more than the books and the academic journals and everything that he and his colleagues have been doing in the last decade or so. He's decided to use photography as a means telling the story. The one person I know of rather much on that subject is John Berger. Quoting, the strength of photography does not lie in its ability to act as fine art, but in its unique capacity to function as a testimony of human choice, a memory aid, and a tool for creating socio-political meaning. Those quotes. So that's the direction that in recent weeks Vishwas has taken. So we shall see how it develops. Because in that context, we now understand that photographs are used to tell stories in many different ways. And Prof. Satgar has been telling stories, advocating, critiquing, and campaigning for climate justice for years. This time around, he has compiled photographs that tell the impact of the deepening climate crisis in communities, entitled Facing the Heat in South Africa, which is the result of years of work, particularly collecting photographs and all that. And suddenly, it's become a curator of some artwork, photography. Things happen. So, this problem is divided into two, or this part in particular. One is the panel discussions. So we've got three panelists here. And Vishwas is going to kick off that process. And then allow just to introduce our panelists, to start with Dr. Vishwas Satgar. He's a professor of international relations, editor of the Democratic Magazine book series, and principal investigator for Emancipatory Future Studies at Wits. He is the author and the lead curator of the photographic exhibition entitled Facing the Heat in South Africa. So we'll see it later on. And then we have right at the end in my far left, and that's Professor Francois Engelbrecht. He is the director of the Global Change Institution, Mandla, focusing on Africa's climate system, and has been involved with the International Panel on Climate Change. Then we have Ms. Jessica Ngwenya. Ms. Jessica Ngwenya is an honors degree graduate in international relations from Wits. He's a policy researcher at Cooperative and Policy Center, and is the lead campaigner for water justice and mobility in the climate justice charter. So she's going to explain what mobility is for some of us to understand. So these are our panelists, ladies and gentlemen, comments. So without any waste of time, I'm going to invite Professor Satgar just to tell us the whole concept of the exhibition, the book, and what it took to write it, and all the things that he has done. So I'm giving him between, let me say 15 minutes. We'll see. Thank you, Dr. Welcome. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. Welcome. So this particular image is now on the book. And it's really a parody. I mean, the message is important. Stop fires before they start. Very important message. But with this one, we cannot pick up a phone and solve this problem. And that's the point about this exhibition. So 10 years ago, I realized we started living on a new planet with a 1 degree Celsius overshoot in planetary temperature since pre-industrial revolution. I was also terrified and curious about how the Earth will respond to more oil, coal, and gas emissions. The science was clear that our emissions trajectory was catastrophic and we needed to cut emissions dramatically. The Paris Climate Agreement was signed in 2015 and hailed as the answer to solve the climate crisis, and climate justice resistance was registering its concerns. Moreover, South Africa was experiencing the worst drought in its history, which commenced in 2014. Normally, South Africa had a 3-year drought cycle, but this drought was grabbing headlines. For the day zero risk it was bringing to Cape Town, our food system was collapsing, high food prices were hitting poor households, and the drought seemed to geospatially have a larger footprint and was enduring. I picked up my camera and decided both as a critical activist scholar and citizen scientist to track climate extremes and resistance. For 10 years I followed weather reports, tracked climate-related events, and connected climate news to place. Traveling to small towns that were in the grip of water stress, driving into flooded farms, experiencing excess rain, driving into an extreme hailstorm and flash flood in Cradock, observing snow and ice shut down the N3 between Harrismith and Van Rieden's Pass, and where I could not experience climate shocks in real time, I visited the ruins left behind from such shocks, such as the April 2022 rain bomb in Durban, extreme wave surges bringing about beach erosion, wildfires, and the tornado that devastated Tonga. I also carried my camera to climate justice protests, many that I co-organized, such as the Hunger Tribunal in 2015 at Constitutional Hill, a Red March in the streets of Johannesburg in 2016, protests outside the JSE, a human chain around Sasol, marches to Sasol councils, AGMs, protests outside Parliament. My digital optic also captured transformative activism, as it built food sovereignty pathways, community solar systems, advanced defense of the ocean commons from offshore oil and gas, and at Parliament, when the Climate Justice Charter movement took a fire brigade to the gates of Parliament in 2021 to demand that Parliament take the science of climate change seriously and adopts the world's first Climate Justice Charter. Now, as my collection of photos grew and eventually reached 800 over 10 years, I knew I was doing documentary photography and capturing climate risk at a 1 degree Celsius planetary overshoot. Nonetheless, I was trying to figure out where this fitted in. Documentary photography has a checkered past, including in documenting working class slums as danger zones for ruling classes in the 19th century. However, in the 20th century, it finds its way into world history, capturing the universal significance of wars, revolutions, mass protests, earthquakes, and other disasters. Across our newspapers, in magazines, and even in television, documentary imagery played a crucial role in affirming a powerful cultural assumption about photographs as artifacts of truth. The idea that a copy of reality was created as light passed through a lens and aperture and was captured on light-sensitive paper has been crucial to documentary photography's social function, but also its idealism. However, in the age we are in, a lot has changed and huge challenges face documentary photography. I had to think about this on my journey. Firstly, we live in a visually saturated culture. We can photograph anything and everything. We send probes into deep space and beam back images. We have micro cameras that can be inserted into the human body, cameras that can go to the depths of the ocean. In our everyday life, the photo image has become so ubiquitous and synonymous with the banal. Selfies, the food we eat, the performative pose are all part of our photographic field. Marketing has also turned the vision of photography into an appendage of the commodity. Finding a space in all of this did make me doubt what I was doing. Nonetheless, I concluded that in a small way, this project is contributing to a subfield of climate crisis documentary photography. It is trying to contribute to answering the question, what is the role of photography in these times of planetary crisis? The second risk to my project has been a very challenging question. Is a digital photograph a photograph? In this debate, I stand on ground with others that recognize that light is captured through a lens in a camera apparatus, turned into pixels and data, digits, and stored. It is a photograph, even if shot through a digital camera, which I have used in this project. Third, we are now entering an age of fake images, computer-generated images, photoshopped images as part of the cybersphere. The faking of photographs is not new and has happened in the past in authoritarian state regimes and as part of propaganda games. However, as someone who enjoys photography as a hobby and who looked at climate extremes through the lens of a citizen scientist, I have a disclaimer in my book, which says very clearly, none of these images have been doctored and manipulated. There is a mirroring of images in part of the book for narrative effect, but this does not take away from the integrity of the images. In this project, I evoked the right to tell. The right was established in the midst of time when the oldest stories were told in the cradle of humankind in southern Africa, long before the colonial encounter. As the archaeological record improves, evidence shows San and nomadic hunter-gatherer presence in South Africa for more than 30,000 years. At the same time, the visual history of South Africa begins with the rock art of the sun, the first attempt to affirm the right to tell in a manner that could live on through time. This venue, the Origin Center, tells the story eloquently. For this reason, I'm also glad it is a venue for hosting the exhibition and book launch. Despite living through the horror of genocidal violence, slavery, and conquest, these peoples continued an oral tradition of telling stories and keeping alive an indigenous worldview. They kept alive the spirit of struggle against erasure on the other side of ecocide. Within the colonial encounter, these peoples were the first to defend the right to tell their story. Paintings in different parts of the country also bear testimony to this, as they document and tell about the presence of colonialists for future generations. What is considered contact period rock art depicts horses, rifles, ox wagons, and people in clothing. The rock art records the colonizer in what we now know of the with the advantage of hindsight to be a deadly intrusion. The struggle against racist ecocide erasure and for the right to tell in South Africa is also imbricated in the history of photography. All before it found a wider critical social role, Walter Benjamin problematized photography's glorification of the wealthy, the narcissism of the native family album, and choreographed stills within studios. But he does not reckon with the imperial expansion of photography to the peripheries. In the South African context, photography had a mimetic impact in white colonial society, in which the colonial outpost was about receiving and living imperial culture. However, in the early 20th century, photography became implicated in native studies and has been referred to as a salvage ethnography, in that it depicts pristine and romantic tribal life before being overtaken by civilization. With the rise of an urban black working class in the 1940s and 1950s, and a growing formalization and resistance to apartheid, photography also became an important medium and tool to provide evidence of racial oppression. The politics of photographic representation are shaped by this graphic retelling of oppression and resistance and its humanist optic. The history of photography in South Africa is implicated in the lived experience of the many. My Facing the Heat project seeks to continue this way of telling in its documentation and stands on the side of the many. However, as John Berger and Jean Moore remind us in their text, Another Way of Telling Mandla, photographs are not simply facts and part of a positivist truth machine. Rather, the meaning of photographs is complicated by the contradictions and tensions between the photographer, the objects in the photograph, the viewer, and how the photographs are used. For me as a citizen scientist, meaning in these photographs are all about climate risk in the moment of taking the photograph. What causes it? What is it? How does it impact our lives? How can we approach this from a climate justice perspective, so we can think these risks in the present and for the future as these risks amplify? I will return to this point about demystifying climate risk in the everyday, so we can rise to these challenges in society. At the same time, and given that photographs are a hybrid form and require captions and narratives to set context at the time of viewing, I need to say something about some of the nomenclature used. The phrase post-normal in this exhibition and book refers to a historical rupture with 11,000 years of Holocene history in which we had a relatively stable climate, and now we are living on a planet increasingly defined by climate extremes. This is the post-normal. The term unnatural climate disasters clarifies that the more we use oil, coal, and gas, the more we heat the Earth climate system, and climate extremes feed back into our lives. These are not natural disasters. The term governance droughts is used to distinguish droughts are documented from meteorological and agricultural droughts, and instead refers to droughts created by state mismanagement, corruption, and failure. This is ubiquitous in our country and is a serious systemic crisis which will only worsen with climate shocks. Finally, there's a distinction made between symbolic and transformative climate justice resistance. Symbolic refers to performative street protest. Transformative refers to climate justice as an ethical political project engaged in building transformative movement capacity from below to confront the worsening poly-crisis. If you want to go deeper into transformative politics, well, there's a book I put out with 27 years of writing, which also makes some of the intellectual arguments called the Love Letter for Climate Justice. And this is a new book based on 14 years of research, worker cooperatives and deep democracy, which again looks at the kind of systems we need to be building from below within the transition. So I hope also, Mandla, this panel engages more on this theme. Conceptually, this project makes the distinction between background and foreground conditions. While the project started out documenting unnatural climate disasters and climate justice resistance, it grew in scope. Hence, it also seeks to tell how in the background lies the causes of the climate crisis. In this regard, the political ecology of extracting coal for more than 100 years, having one of the most carbon-intensive economies amongst BRIC countries, and still relying on coal expansion for our energy needs is a crucial causal factor. Together with Sasol's Secunda plant having the highest point emissions in the world, we are amongst the top 15 carbon emitters. At the same time, we have a Presidential Climate Commission led by a president who vaunts the expansion of the minerals energy complex to the oceans as a game changer. South Africa has an unjust transition, with a fossil fuel addicted ruling class not serious about foregrounding the worsening climate crisis. At the same time, given the failure of the Paris Climate Agreement, Southern Africa and South Africa are facing a 3 degrees Celsius reality, given that we are heating at twice the global average, and when the planet overshoots 1.5 degrees Celsius later this decade. My exhibition and book is asking the question, what lessons can we learn from a 1 degree Celsius planetary overshoot to prepare the country? How to prepare for this reality, society has to own the climate crisis problem and its systemic solutions. Our political ruling class and elites have failed, and even if the state wakes up to the climate crisis, it is too complex and big for the state to deal with. The idea of society taking responsibility is a central message of this exhibition and book. We should not look up, but look to the aggregation of collective power from below. Linked to this is the need for society to come to terms with its fossil fuel addiction as part of the background conditions causing the worsening climate crisis. The electricity that powers homes, workplaces, and cities, cars we drive in, rail transport, shipping, factories, and farms are all implicated in causing the climate crisis. This project poses the question, how do you contribute to the worsening climate crisis in your everyday lives? It's about asking you to tell honestly where you stand. It's not enough for us merely to point to fossil fuel capital and the state. We need to own the problem and solution in our everyday lives. We need to engage in transformative resistance and build community-owned renewable energy systems. We need to join and support campaigns for eco-mobility. We need to democratize the water commons in our towns and cities. We need to build food sovereignty common systems and more in our households and communities. We need as society to lead transformative adaptation from below, a point I will return to. We need to make these transformative practices visible and share these inspiring transformative examples. These positive solidarities are crucial for post-normal politics to come to the fore. A big part of this project focuses on unnatural climate disasters. This telling is different from the war photography that Susan Sontag, in her Regarding the Pain of Others, invites us to humanize with an ethics of seeing. This project foregrounds our collective climate risks, registering in our everyday lives. It's about our collective pain and invites an ethical frame of justice, care, love, and solidarity. The climate crisis is a great leveler and will engulf all our lives if it hasn't already. So departing from Sontag's ethical frame as it relates to war photography, these photographs want to incite your own self-agency to confront an unfolding and worsening climate crisis that risks everything for each one of us. These photographs of unnatural climate disasters are evidence from a crime scene. The harms and climate injustice experienced leave no room for climate denialism. More than 600 people have died from unnatural climate disasters, despite the government knowing the urgencies of climate science and receiving the vocal concerns of climate justice forces. This death toll is more than the number of lives lost during the Sharpeville massacre and the Soweto uprising. The lives of the many did not matter then, and they certainly do not matter now. This archive of photographs is an indictment. It bears witness and gives testimony. It's a brazen telling of truth to power. By now, South Africa should have developed a bottom-up national climate risk assessment and put in place a societal-driven response strategy as part of post-normal leadership in politics to ensure serious adaptive capacity. It has not done this. This project and platform calls on the country's leaders to do this with society now. The powerful have to be told that the more than 500 dead in the Durban rain bomb and 100 in the Umtata flood is on your watch. How many more humans and more than humans must die because of failing leadership? Moreover, the documentation of climate extremes as governance droughts, extreme storms, heat and wildfires, excessive rain, and tornadoes is certainly not an exhaustive list. We know from climate science that cyclones are likely to make landfall, and a strong El Niño will also amplify the impact of some of these risks. Nonetheless, from a citizen science perspective, my investigation also disaggregates the risks I observed and provides forensic insight into these moments of climate shocks impacting stressed and fragile socio-ecological systems. These images affirm that the meaning of weather has changed in the everyday. However, we do not need to be fear-ridden and be caught in doom and gloom. These images invite us to think with them in the present and in preparation for the future, for the looming 1.5 degrees Celsius planetary overshoot. There aren't ready-made answers in these images, but if you view them carefully, like I have, there are clues for transformative adaptation responses. Let me give you some examples or little vignettes. So after our drought, I was very concerned by the excess rain that was falling across the country. And I watched this through watching dams release immense amounts of water. So this is how it amid my dam. But I left these kinds of moments thinking, well, is the country managing what happens downriver? And a few months later, I visited on the west coast, a little town called Wits. And there, the problem hit me squarely in the face. The Clan William Dam had excess water in it because of heavy rains, and it just released it without any planning, without any thought. And basically, downriver, which is what I captured in these two images, was devastating impact. It cut off one of the roads leading into Witsville, so people couldn't use it. At the same time, the Olifants River burst its banks, and this wine estate was completely flooded. Now, what this calls for, again, if we're thinking about climate risk in the everyday and for us to own the problem and solutions, well, communities around this Olifants River need to set up a river committee. They need to organize their local council. They need to meet with the Department of Water Affairs. We need to be talking about how to manage these dams. What should we do with the surplus water? Should it be used to recharge aquifers and redirect it? Should this water be stored in reservoirs and so on? Reservoirs and so on. And should we manage the flow of water in these rivers? This is very, very important. This is just another example of driving into a hectic storm in Craddock. And basically, when we parked the car, it was hail everywhere and so on. But the takeaway is the image at the bottom. Basically, there was a flash flood. And trying to figure out how to get out of this flash flood was a big deal. But the point about this is that the drainage systems in our communities are not cleaned. They're not managed. This water is sitting there and building up. Okay, we're going to have more of this. Again, if communities own the problem and the solutions, they need to be pushing for climate jobs to clean their manholes, their drainage systems, their sluice gates, etc., etc. I'll use one final example and then I'll wrap up my life. And this is basically the chief of the Mossel Bay fire station. And I took several photographs in the area documenting wildfires. And he admitted to me that after the big Knysna fire, the fires that have erupted and have been happening in Knysna are 2 to 3 times bigger than what happened in Knysna. And basically the firefighting services in our country, which are local government competency, basically are under-resourced. And he had to pull back these firefighting services. Now again, if we want to own the problem and the solution as society, this photograph and these vignettes are telling us we need a national firefighting service in this country now. Now, this can create climate jobs. These firefighters can do defensive firefighting, they can reduce fire load, etc., etc. So I'm not going to get into all of this because of time, but just to say this community on the Palmet River in Durban, they got out of harm's way with the Durban rain bomb because they had an early warning system that they built up, but others were not so fortunate. So to conclude, the transformative responses I've been mentioning will become part of climate emergency discourse and transformative climate resistance to deal with immediate climate risk in the everyday in our communities, workplaces, sectors, and the state. I hope this book and exhibition prompts this kind of thinking and learning to prepare us now for a 1.5 degree Celsius overshoot. This is what I mean by demystifying climate risk. My final point before I sit down is that if we really want to tackle what is a planetary problem, this planetary problem is organized in national spaces through the use of fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas. It also registers in national spaces. The only way to have the confidence to tackle this problem is if we have a climate justice political project. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just put a comma on that. You will still come back.
Okay.
Yeah, I realize that you going back to your activities. Shop steward and all.
Yes.
Okay. No, that's fine. Thanks very much, because you have helped us to understand the subject and narrated the content of the subject. But you have not only done that, you have also suggested how we act and the kind of strategies, mobilization, campaigning, etc. So that's quite useful for us. But we're going to expand the discussion by inviting the two panelists that are here. I do want to start with Professor Francois. Just one question, and I'll come back to you. Does this exhibition, I'm sure you've seen the exhibition, and the book, I'm sure you've had the insight. All this, does it speak to the agencies of climate change as you have come to understand it in your work? Yep.
Thank you very much, Martha, and thanks so much, Vish, for a great privilege to be here today. Yes, colleagues, when I, as a climatologist, just think about the title of the book, Facing the Heat in South Africa, I think about it very literally. So we are a country that, as...
We can hear all of us?
No.
Okay.
Right, let me see.
Yeah.
Can I speak up?
Yeah.
We are a country, of course, that are warming at twice the global rate of warming, as Vish just mentioned in the talk. So here where we are today in Johannesburg, the average temperature is already 3 degrees Celsius higher than in the 1900s. That's a very, very strong realization. And the rate of temperature increase is even higher to the north of us, into Botswana and southern Zambia. And it's of course not only the average temperatures that are rising, it's also the heat waves that are becoming more intense. So the South African future climatologically is, in the first place, a much warmer future. So we will increasingly have to deal with more oppressive temperatures impacting on our region. So I think that the emphasis that the book places on the joint risks of heat waves and drought, that's really important. So a specific bit of news that is now currently breaking in climate science is that we are now moving back in the so-called El Niño cycle after having some really good rainfall years here in South Africa. And 2026-27 summer is likely going to be El Niño. But the breaking news is that it may possibly be the biggest El Niño ever measured by humans. And therefore it means that it may be the warmest summer in the history of South Africa. So what is that going to do in terms of our people that are still in informal housing, as we see demonstrated in the exhibition? What about our outdoor workers? So as long as greenhouse gas emissions are going to increase, South Africa will continue to warm over the interior parts at about twice the global rate of warming. So although this upcoming summer may very well be the warmest one many of us have ever experienced, all of us, I see a few kids in the audience, which is really wonderful. And I see people much younger than myself and our author here today, our guest of honor. And for you, the young people here, the sad reality is that this summer will probably be one of the coolest you've ever experienced in your lives. Because global warming is set to continue with this continued dependence on fossil fuels. So facing the heat in South Africa, that also about extreme events becoming more frequent. So it's also important to realize that in a regional climate that becomes warm, there are also more extreme rainfall events, especially in the eastern parts of South Africa. The warmer we make the ocean, the more water vapor ends up in the atmosphere. The warmer the atmosphere is, the more water vapor it can carry, making storm systems even more intense. So heat waves are an important part of our climate future. So are more intense droughts. But when conditions are favorable for rainfall, like during the past summer, which was a La Nina, we have the potential of even more devastating flood events than in the past. So yes, for me, having paged through the book some months ago for the first time, a draft version, and seeing the exhibition, it's certainly a very vivid demonstration of what is awaiting us in the next 10 years and beyond in terms of climate change risks here in South Africa.
Thank you. Can give it to Jessica. For you, Jessica, it's just, if you look at the book, or read the book, and you look at the exhibition, what images come to you, and why so?
Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for having me on this panel today. I think similarly to Dr. Francois, the title, Facing the Heat, was something that we thought a lot about when putting the exhibition together and curating the space, both conceptually and practically. And so once you get into the exhibition and are in the space and go past the background conditions into the piece around unnatural climate disasters, there's a cabinet there, and we get to zoom in on these 3 vignettes that tell the story around some unnatural climate disasters and the impacts. And in that cabinet, there's an image there that stands out to me of this schoolboy standing in front of a wall. And initially it's like just an unassuming image, he's just standing next to the wall. But as you see the other images around it, the story sort of emerges. There's a teacher with these textbooks out on the floor, drying them. And there's an image of the classroom with the floor being ripped out. And what had happened in that community is that there was a flood, and the water had stood in that school for 3 days. And you sort of go back to this image of this boy just looking at you through the camera, and there's a water line which is just above his knee. And I guess the reality sort of hits, and in this moment we have to face the heat, that if we don't change anything, if we think about the reality of climate extreme impacts and failing infrastructure, that water line will increase. And so it's one of those moments in the exhibition where we have to face the heat, but it doesn't end there. We have to consider what needs to be done to make sure that this doesn't happen again and that water line doesn't go further and further up.
Thank you. Let's go back to Francois. Because you are involved in the International Panel on Climate Change. So with this book and the exhibition, in what way do you think the book and the exhibition help us to understand what the UN Paris climate change?
Yes. Yeah, the colleagues, I still remember the excitement when South Africa also signed the Paris Agreement back in 2050. And
sorry, can you just hold
oh,
on?
okay. Yeah, I still remember when our own country signed off on the Paris Agreement in 2015. It was a time of great optimism. It was a time of solidarity international. And what has happened since? Well, the Paris Agreement, of course, if I want to summarize in one sentence, trying to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius, preferably below 1.5 degrees Celsius. So what happened since then? In 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published a special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius. And I had a great privilege of being part of that report. So I remember the day that we launched the report, it was in South Korea. And the IPCC launched the report under the theme of reasons for hope. And it worked like this. The report documented the impacts that climate change will have across the world should we reach the 1.5 degrees Celsius level of global warming. And the IPCC said, no, but there's hope that we can have all the hope in the world that we will never reach that level, because we have the technologies to transition away from fossil fuels and achieve a 45% reduction of carbon dioxide emissions by 2030. That was the target the science set. And then carbon neutrality should be achieved by 2050. That was the message from the scientists. So what have we seen since 2018? Right? We were supposed to see a 45% reduction in emissions by 2030. So what we've seen are further increases in emissions. So since 2018, we've seen an increase of another 5% in emissions, which is now a massive amount of additional carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere every year. And from 2023 to 24, we saw the biggest year-to-year increase in emissions since we have reliable measurements going back to the 1970s, with the biggest increase in atmospheric concentration. So we've not achieved what science told us was very urgently needed back in 2018. So as we meet here today, it can now no longer be avoided that we will exceed 1.5 degrees Celsius. So the last 3 years were in fact, on the average, 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than the pre-industrial temperature. 2024 is the warmest year on the record at 1.6 degrees Celsius, warmer than the pre-industrial temperature. Now, El Nino usually, strong El Nino adds about 0.2 degrees to the global temperature. So 2027, the year after the big El Nino, if it does materialize, the prediction, may well take us to about 1.8 degrees Celsius of global warming. So we are now starting to, the scientific quest now is to see, is it still possible to keep us below 2 degrees Celsius of global warming? But at these current emission rates, we are now heading towards doubling carbon dioxide concentrations, somewhere in the 2040s, and exceeding the 2 degrees Celsius level of global warming, somewhere in the 2 degrees Celsius, somewhere in the 2040s. So what I can say in conclusion is, it seems as if the international solidarity we've had in 2015, I think we can all see it, colleagues, we can all see it with our own eyes. It's gone. The current geopolitics is not working in the favor of climate change mitigation. Quite the opposite. So we can say that we as humanity, we have certainly failed in implementing the Paris Agreement on climate change. So it is now too late to avoid a 1.5 degrees Celsius level. Three more years of emissions at current rates and we are permanently over 1.5 degrees Celsius. There's no reason to think that can be avoided. And it's going to be a tremendous challenge to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. I would say in the current geopolitics, an impossibility. So we have failed to implement the Paris Agreement in terms of its strongest temperature goal. And it's going to be very, very difficult to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius. Which is important when we have the book documenting some of the changes we can already see, which should help to prepare us for even more extreme events in South Africa, also as we now enter the 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius level of global warming.
Thank you. Vishwas, in his opening statement, and I think in the book, you could help us to understand what those differences are and how they relate to the kind of work that you are doing campaigning in the community, etc.
Yeah, so in the book and in the exhibition, you'll see that there is a distinction between symbolic resistance and transformative resistance. And so symbolic resistance speaks to that very public, visible challenge towards institutions and systems. I sort of think about it as like the first thing that comes to mind when you think about activism, people on the streets, protesting, banners, posters, hashtags, etc. It's trying to draw that attention and gain that recognition around a particular issue. And then when we think about transformative resistance, this is where we sort of go a step further and a step deeper. And climate justice as transformative resistance is a political project. Once we've dismantled the system and made the noise, the question that lies there is what's next. And so through transformative resistance, we get to come together and think about what it means to build the next society from below. And so within the Climate Justice Charter movement, this is sort of housed within the Climate Justice Charter, which presents a pluri-vision for society, thinking about how do we address our current history and history of apartheid within our country, how do we build a just and democratic future for all. And so this is by working with communities, workplaces and sectors, brainstorming and building that next society, whether it's through our food sovereignty pathways, our water commons, socially owned renewable energy, and that work of doing that. And I think within our water campaign, our eco-mobility campaign, this has looked like standing together with water-stressed communities and being involved in that sort of activism. It has looked like mapping water-stressed communities across the country. It's looked at workshopping communities around water justice and water sovereignty. With our eco-mobility campaign, that's thinking about how do we transition our transport system around eco-mobility and clean energy alternatives. So that includes walking, cycling, thinking about our taxi industry and what it means to include them in our just transition. And so our policy work is where we get to do this, where we get to think about building the next society.
Going through the exhibition, just having gone through the book, skills there, through it. Vishwas makes quite a bold statement. Oh, sorry. Let me just repeat a little bit. My apologies for that. So going through the exhibition and skimming through the book, the sense I get is that Vishwas is making quite a very bold statement to the effect that South Africa is not ready for a 1.5 Celsius overshoot. That's quite a bold one, and likely in this decade. And the proposal there is that South Africa should be placed on climate emergency footing. So that's action, basically, including through climate emergency contract and the society-wide driven climate risk assessment response strategy and all that. So just the two of you. So what are your thoughts on that? I think Jessica already started. Let me start with you, and then we'll go back to Francois.
Yeah, I think that's a very important question and observation, and there are a couple of questions within the exhibition, and this is one of those main ones. Is South Africa ready for a 1.5 degree overshoot? And I think we are kind of aware of our current political climate in this country. It's very precarious. We have an uncaring and corrupt leadership, and I think the crisis of socio-ecological reproduction is quite clear when you think about hunger, poverty, unemployment, that's very real in our country, and this is all compounded and exacerbated by the climate crisis. And I think for a lot of young people, hearing the prospect is not very encouraging, and it can feel like the image is bleak. And this is only on a local context and not even considering border issues. And so I think the reality is quite clear that Cupcake and Gang are not going to save us. We have a very serious minerals energy complex. And they're going to continue, I think, to lock us into fossil fuels, like Vish mentioned. President of the Presidential Climate Commission warns offshore oil and gas as a game changer for South Africa. And so it's quite clear where we are headed. And I think it shows us that the urgency around the climate crisis is very important. And putting the country on a climate emergency social footing is very important. The climate crisis exacerbates our existing social issues. And so I think that's where the climate emergency social contract comes into play. And through the policy work that's been done through the CJC, and this is an opportunity to sort of be the basis of that, to bring these policies to the forefront and for us to engage around these issues and think about what's next and how we build that next society. And I think the urban warning system is also something that's important, or the climate risk assessment, doing that nationwide climate risk assessment so we know what the risks are and what changes need to be made. And so yeah, I think I'll just leave it for there.
Thank you, Jessica. I'll pick up on this last point you've made about risk assessment and a warning system. Are we ready for the 1.5 degrees Celsius world? So I think if we look at the latest climate predictions, we may have a chance that 2026 will still be slightly below 1.5 degrees Celsius of global warming. Last year was 1.48 rates were. But colleagues, I think this big El Nino, which has a very good chance to materialize, very good chance it will be El Nino, and some likelihood it will be so-called strong or super El Nino. It will send us to well above 1.5 degrees Celsius, and I think we will never return to reality. So I think 1.5 degrees Celsius has now effectively arrived. So it's not clear that there will ever be technologies that can scale up and remove some of the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere again. So this one should not have blind faith in hearing about carbon dioxide removal technologies. Because right now they are science fiction. They don't exist where they can be applied at scale. So the hard reality is 1.5 degrees Celsius is here. So are we ready? I'll just mention two examples that I think clearly demonstrate that we're not ready. And the one is the possibility of day zero drought in the Gauteng province. So a very strong El Nino typically takes 40% down in terms of the vol dam level. So if you look at the integrated Vaal River system, a so-called super El Nino like 2015-16 can have a staggering drop in dam levels in 1 year. It can be in the order of 40%. So you can go from, say, a system that is in good shape as it is right now after the La Nina seasons. You can sit at, say, 80% of water levels in the integrated Vaal River system. But the super El Nino brings it down to 40% in 1 year. And if we then have a multi-year drought, such as you described, Vish, in the book and in the presentation just now, if you have a second, if the El Nino lasts into a second cycle, and you have 2 or 3 and then 4 dry years in a row, we're in Gauteng day zero territory. Something that has never happened before. But El Nino makes the droughts worse. And then climate change makes the El Nino droughts even worse. And the heat waves are worse, and we lose even more water from evaporation. So what is the way to prepare for such a drought? It's to have the water infrastructure in perfect form. Not to have any water losses between the Vaal Dam and Gauteng. But right now we are looking at about 40% losses from depleted infrastructure, leakages of the reservoirs, of the pipelines, and of course issues around non-revenue water. So 40% of the water that leaves the lowland can't be accounted for. So that is not how we prepare for a day zero drought in Gauteng. So we are obviously not prepared. And let's hope that this drought does not become a multi-year drought and that we can tackle this massive water infrastructure issue we have in Gauteng. I think in terms of drought risk, we are not ready. Also in terms of our own behavior, the household demand is really high in Gauteng. And we can certainly all do in terms of how we use water. And the second example I'll just bring also comes from a book, and it's about the Durban floods. The Durban floods, we were not prepared in 2022. Even though there was a very similar event in 2019 that took about 70 lives in the larger Durban area. It did not change anything on the ground when the same event just went more intense, happened 3 years later. And what we need here is this greater response from civil society. What can save lives in Durban are community-based flood early warning systems. There was one such a system in place in 2022 in April in the so-called Palmit River region. The Quarry Road community responded to the early warning. And that's a wonderful story to read, positive story, about hundreds of lives were saved in that community because the community leaders knew what to do. They trusted the warnings and the scientists, and they evacuated their community. But we need that type of system in about 500 flood-prone communities in the larger Durban area alone. Then we don't even talk about further to the south into the Eastern Cape. So we need a massive scale. And if we can have that type of civil society partnership, as we now see manifesting in Durban in the form of the Durban Coalition, there's a chance of at least saving lives when the next big flood disaster comes to Durban. And then, as I say, there are many parts of KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape that face the same type of risk. So it's not only about Durban. Climate change science tells us that we should expect a further doubling in the rainfall totals in Durban should we reach the 2 degrees Celsius. So that's a massive type of flood that will even pale what we've seen in April 2022, that our climate models are projecting under 2 degrees Celsius of global. So as it is, we are not ready. We are seeing positive signs in terms of civil society in taking the leadership and starting to get more communities involved in at least flood preparedness. But when it comes to finding safe land for people and safe housing, just along these East Coast areas, I mean in Durban alone, there's 250,000 people living below the flood. What type of intervention is needed to change that vulnerability in the long run? Saving lives is important, but what about the long-term resilience? These are massive challenges that we are facing, and as it stands right now, we are left extremely vulnerable to the arrival of the 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Thank you, and Jessica. Before I open up for the audience, maybe Vishwas, you just help us just to wrap up, to respond. I like the note we ended, which is a home. You have a big responsibility. Thank you.
Well, I'll just pick up on what Francois and Jessica just said. Is there anyone here from the Presidential Climate Commission? Because we have invited the Presidential Climate Commission. No, okay. Well, that also tells us something about the problem we have in this country, okay? This is not just about pointing fingers. We were serious about this, all right? Getting them there. There's a serious conversation to be had, and this conversation needs to be moving to the center of our country, into the mainstream of our country. I think the points that Francois and Jessica are making, you know, they force us to think about political approaches to these problems. This idea of a climate emergency social contract, this idea of a national climate risk assessment and societal driven response. These are political ideas, and they are very, very important ideas. Now again, they're on the margins because they come from us as scholars and activists and so on. But we've got to get these ideas into the mainstream very fast, given the urgency around the 1.5 degrees Celsius overshoot that's looming. I want to also add this, that this idea of working bottom up, the more I did this project, I became convinced that if society is not mobilized around adaptation and decarbonization, again, we are tilting at windmills, okay? There's a thing called the ingenuity rate. The more you have people figuring out a problem, the better for a society, okay? And this problem is complex. I was telling Patrick Bond and his team the other day, it's not like the HIV/AIDS struggle where you make one demand for antiretrovirals. It's not the same thing. There's multiple dimensions to this problem. And that means we've got to have a collective politics around it, because the problem is going to express itself in different ways in different places. And I saw that over the past 10 years. And so we're going to have to build that capacity from below. My final point is this, hand over to Mandla, is that we know enough now. We've got the climate science, we've got the urgencies, we've got the warnings. I did my little citizen science documentation. I got some very powerful insights into what's coming. As a society, we need to really start making decisions so we don't have any regrets. We need to start making decisions so that we err on the side of precaution. We don't need this death toll to go up and up and up. We know. We need to act now. This is the imperative around this exhibition and this conversation. Thank you, Mandla.
Thank you very much. We can begin that. Thanks, Vish. So I'm going to open for questions, for comments, or observation on the discussions that we've had now. If you had an opportunity to check the exhibition, you can comment, but we're still going to go there. You have not read the book, I suppose. You will buy the book. So can I take hands? So I'm going to start here. It's 1, 2. So you say your name, organization. If there's an organization, yourselves. It's only 2. Others. And then 3, 4. That's fine. So let's start. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Andy Chin, I'm a human rights activist. My question to yourself, because I haven't seen the exhibition, I haven't read the book, and I was wondering with you covering anything with regards to the impact of artificial intelligence, specifically the creation of data centers around the world now. I think the prediction from a human rights perspective, and I don't think there's a for many years, people used to separate human rights from climate change, and I think it's now common knowledge that it's as important or more important than a human rights issue right now. But there's how do we balance the climate change targets that we have versus the implementation of AI technologies? Do you cover that in your work?
Okay. So just take this 4, then we'll come back. You have a second one.
Thank you, Erin Canvas, Professor of Politics
UJ. Thank you so much for the really critically important work. My question is about the relationship between adaptation and mitigation. And it's a tough question, right? How much structural change is possible with a focus on local responses, you know, and adaptation? And how can we, or how do you foresee, like if this was implemented fully and profoundly, we still have the major elephant in the room, right? So how do you draw the connections between how much impact this can have and also on mitigation?
Thank you. And yeah. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Kayla from TEDx Johannesburg. To Prof. Engelbrecht, it's really about the renewing global solidarity around the Paris Agreement. Is there hope that will ever change? And also the effects of war. I've been switching on my television every day. I've been yet to hear one person talking about renewables. So when we talk about cupcake at the end, wanting to mine whatever they mine, should we blame them seeing what we see on the streets?
Okay. Last time, the fourth one. Oh, it's 6 minutes.
Thanks, I'm Charles Tay, I'm just a member of the public. Prof. Vishwas, you mentioned that you felt that there's a very strong need for mitigation of climate change to take place from the bottom up, from communities, etc. And I just wonder if any work has been done on establishing templates on how these committees are established, how they're funded, which is a big thing, I think, and that kind of stuff. Is there something that a community, if they get together and say, we need to mitigate against climate change, are there resources on which they can draw in order to activate? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm not sure who wants to start. Okay, Prof, your side.
Right, I'll comment a bit on mitigation versus adaptation. And the question about politics and war are difficult for me to refer to. This is something I guess. I'll just say that I think if we look today at who's responsible for emissions, then we may choose to start by saying that China is responsible for 30% of the world's current carbon dioxide emissions. The United States is historically, still by far, the biggest emitter. So we can say that without the United States and China, which currently are responsible for about 45% of the emissions, without them cooperating and jointly mitigating, we can't solve the global warming problem. But another interesting realization is if we look at all the countries in the world that are responsible for 1.5% of emissions or less, if we add them all together, we find another 50% of the emissions. That's another China. So that's an interesting realization. Even if the smaller emitters are not contributing fairly to mitigation and phase out emissions by 2050 latest, we also contribute exceeding the 2 degrees Celsius level of global warming. So we need also South Africa to make its own fair contribution to mitigation. It's in our own interest to contribute to phasing out fossil fuels across the world. Because otherwise the impacts just become devastating across the African continent and also in southern Africa. What about adaptation? Absolutely, we must have a very strong focus on adaptation because at the same time it's true that if we mitigate strongly, but the United United States and China and the other big economies don't, we will not have benefits from that mitigation in the context of avoiding dangerous climate change. We will still have many local benefits in terms of reduced air pollution impacting on our health. But if the entire world doesn't walk this path together, we will still face severe climate change in South Africa, no matter what we do here in terms of coal. So we must be responsible and have a very strong focus on preparing for impacts. So we must now prepare for impacts of 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius of global warming in terms of how those impacts will look in South Africa. And that's about adaptation, that's about resilience building, that's about climate smart disaster risk management and so forth. So there we have a lot of things we can do. Some of them we can do ourselves, and for others we really, under the principles of climate justice, should get international funding support, as is currently and agreed within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change Processes, although it is unfortunately very much a theoretical agreement and that the funds are not really flowing at the scale where they should be flowing to the developing world.
Yeah, I think the question around like how do we engage with this issue and what is sort of the vision for society, and also I think the link around climate justice and human rights is so important. And I think why I appreciate this exhibition, because I think for a lot of people, climate justice is just a separate, arbitrary issue on the side, and there are many more important issues that we need to deal with, and we'll get to climate justice and renewables later. And I think what this exhibition helps with is it sort of draws those connections between the climate crisis as a planetary crisis and how no one is excluded from this reality of floods and fires and droughts, etc. And so I think the climate crisis is an entry point to help us uncover and deal with the rest of the crises that we are aware of. And I think with regards to what is that next society, I think those 14 systemic alternatives help us start to imagine and build the next society. How do we transform our food system? What does that really look like? How do we think about energy and socially owned renewable energies? And I think it's incredible that on this campus we get to experiment with that at our food sovereignty hubs and in our Wits gardens. It's not just students gardening so they can get their fingers dirty, but it's really that political project and reimagining society. And so I think there is hope. And when thinking about hope and building the next society from below, I think that's a very important point. That idea that we don't have to wait for people up above, but as communities we can get together and start that work. And so there are activist guides that teach communities to think about water sovereignty and democratizing the water commons and how can we workshop them around those issues. And yeah, I'll leave it there and maybe you can unpack that a bit more.
So the exhibition doesn't deal directly with AI, but it does something that I'm sure is going to invite a lot of debate from my other friends in the climate justice space, in that it poses a question to us as members of society and what responsibility we have for the climate crisis. So, AI has a massive carbon footprint, and the more we get pushed in this direction, or we choose it, well, these data centers have to be built, it's going to use rare earths and other things, it's going to use massive amounts of water, it's going to emit a lot of carbon, etc. So this exhibition is provoking this question. It's asking us how to live. Now, I am not anti-technology, but I am a techno-realist. And I think in the world we are in now, with all these converging crises, we have to ask deeper questions about technology and what technology choices we are making. The second quick point I want to make is that, COVID-19, from those of us who were kind of busy during COVID-19, because we could see the gap between the state and society, it was very revealing that, as the state and the Solidarity Fund came short in terms of food issues, it was communities that were holding things together. Okay, they were stepping in front, they were mobilizing, they were getting food aid going at a micro scale, they were getting gardens going, etc., etc. The July 2021 violence, again, is very revelatory and teaches us something about what happens from below in this country. It was communities that held it together, okay, that basically got organized, that sought to protect themselves, and so on and so on. The state was absent, the police was absent, and so on and so on. And I want to argue today, from what I've seen over the past 10 years, you know, the school that Jessica mentioned in Ladysmith, I mean, the teacher kind of drying the textbooks, the state was absent. After that flood impacted that school for 3 days, no one came from the National Department of Education or anything, okay? Those teachers and those students were scrambling to get their school clean. They cleaned it, they removed debris, etc., and they got the learning project going, okay? So if we think that, and if the assumption of politics that we all are going to work with is that the state is going to step up and solve the climate crisis, my appeal to you today is disabuse yourself of that. We need to work together. The power lies with us. The final point I'll make is that, and Jessica's mentioned activist tools and so on. We've been in discussion with Francois about the mapping they've done around the kind of risks facing communities across the country. We are in the process of developing an activist tool. So the Palmate River / Quarry Road community is one example of an early warning system. But there are other examples where communities had river management committees, or other examples where in Joburg, Ferro Adams here, they tried to democratize and monitor the water system in the city, etc. So the activist tool we're going to be developing will pull together these examples where communities are developing local protocols, etc. I think it's in Merebank, where they did some work around a local protocol for extreme weather. We are going to be pulling this all together, and we'll be running workshops across the country, so work with us. Thank you.
Okay, let me take the second round of hands. If there's any, and if I see somebody, I can just point to you and say, talk. Number one. Who's the second one? Only 1, 2, 3. Okay. Great. Let's leave it there at 3, and then we'll start with you. Thank you.
I'm currently running as the National Coordinator for the South African Waste Pickers Association, and they currently have a project on the Clean Air Fund, which is basically to mitigate against air pollution by dumping and burning waste. Now, Prof. Engelbrecht mentioned that already we are losing 40% of our water through infrastructural dysfunctions. For somebody like that, because we work with communities, it begs to give us that if we are already struggling in maintaining the current infrastructure, how are we going to scale up so that it's repaired, and then we can talk about mitigating structures or adaptation structures? Because I think it was 5 years back when we realized that they said Johannesburg doesn't have a disaster management strategy. So if we are going towards that type of thinking, that means we need to work with communities, because at that level, it's where they will be able to adapt themselves without government being present.
Okay. Come here. Yeah.
Prophet, I'd like to ask your view on the fossil fuel proliferation treaty that's been signed. I think it's of the same nature as that antique nuclear one. And I wanted to know if you know what South Africa's involvement in that, because they seem to be making quite a
see, I don't think our people on the ground are aware of how much trouble we are all in, to simply put it, you know. And I think these initiatives, I think Dr. Bush for all his effort and our scientists, but I think we need to design. I think we need the most simplest method or way of reaching the people on the ground. Because as we know how people are powerful when they get together and get themselves together for a certain cause. You know, we've seen it when we were fighting against the oppressive system. And we need to really find the simplest method, the simplest way of informing them how much danger we are to our society, we are, how much danger we are all in. That's all I wanted to say.
Yeah. Maybe I'll use my judgment to get the other people to speak. Very. I'm pointing you. I'm pointing you. If you have a lot of experience in children.
I don't know what I'm supposed to say, so I think a few things I was thinking about when we were talking all of this. The one issue for me, and something we've been trying to deal with, is the focus on a just energy transition at a national level, at a political level, which it links to what you were saying in terms of not being, climate change is something out there. So the just energy transition becomes something that's separate, then we deal with water separate, we deal with food separate, and that is part of the problem, and I think that's where activists need to. The other thing I wanted to say is, one of the things, and I was going to ask, I didn't know how to frame it, is that with these emergencies or these crises that are coming, whether it's water, whether it's the floods and droughts, there's this move, this like, I want to say vulturization from the private sector that's looking at risk, in terms of climate, that's looking at risk in terms of flooding, and then of course this failing infrastructure. And it's becoming harder and harder to actually, like you're saying, Vish, having the activists on the ground, having this network from the bottom up, it's becoming too hard. I don't know how we respond to it.
Thank you. I saw. Yeah. Okay.
Prof. Okay, shall I go to this Patrick on? Just to contest Francois Engelbrecht, would you not agree that the greatest climate scientist, James Hansen, we have no dispute, we both respect his work, he had a one-word scientific analysis of the Paris Climate Agreement. Do you remember that? His one-word assessment was bullshit. The reason for that scientific assessment was because there was no accountability. Moreover, there was a provision saying that the polluters don't pay. There's no accountability, no liability, no compensation, no reparations, no climate debt. The optimism of the elites, not you, but the elites, reflected that the climate imperialists, right, G7, Todd Stern, the key negotiator, and the BRICS, and this goes back to 2009, Copenhagen, when Barack Obama met Jacob Zuma, Benji Manmohan Singh, and Lula. And they met, and they slapped each other on the back, and they said, let's pollute. You pollute, we pollute. Let's call it the Copenhagen Accord. And they agreed on three things. Don't emissions to the extent necessary. Two, don't admit you emitted. No reparations, no accountability. Number three, let's privatize the air through carbon markets, through offsets, instead of cutting emissions. So I appreciate you saying we failed, but wouldn't you rather say they failed? Imperialism and climate sub-imperialism, the G7 and the BRICS, and calling the BRICS out, calling South Africa out, calling the Durban Climate Summit out in 2011, COP17, a conference of polluters that was formidable and led Todd Stern to write the WikiLeaks email to Hillary Clinton that they'd succeeded, right? That the G7 and the BRICS together have succeeded. So I don't know where you get optimism, my friend. There's no optimism you had when the imperialists and sub-imperialists worked together against all the rest of us. And secondly, why get any optimism out of Durban? The real adaptation money, I think you know, is going in South Durban for pumping and stormwater drainage. In one site, it's the Toyota plant in Isipingo, 280 million. That's where adaptation money goes, because the ruling class of Durban has decided that instead of making proper houses, no quarry roads, no Kennedy roads, which is incredibly dangerous given this steep slopes, get proper housing? No. Instead, make sure that Toyota doesn't get flooded. How many electric vehicles are made in Durban in the Toyota plant or anywhere in this country?
Okay.
Zero.
Okay. Okay. You're fine.
I just wanted to add on to what Molefe said and what the last speaker also ended with, is that so many people in our country live in such precarious circumstances. There's no security with regard to their homes, let alone the food, and let alone being aware of the risks, the heightened risks by climate change. And that I feel like we need to have an approach that allows us to take all of these things into account, so that people can be aware that yes, you need to sort this out, but you need to do it in this way because there's this problem too. Yes, you're carrying a huge burden of worrying about X, Y, and Z, but you have to worry about this too. And I don't know how we do that, but it's just something that needs to be added to the conversation.
My name is Frank. My question, I'm sorry I forgot the name of the professor. Sorry. When you talk about the capacity of communities, can you expand?
Okay. So the rest will have discussions as we look at the exhibition and experts. But for now, can we have responses to these observations and questions?
Yes, thank you very much, Frank, for another round of really interesting comments. Let me start by saying that as far as the Paris Agreement on climate change is concerned, we've had a very interesting ruling last year from the International Court of Justice that ruled that the polluter pays principle applies to countries that have failed to meet the obligation as under the Paris Agreement. Which means that the developing countries such as Mozambique can, by this opinion of the court, can now make a case for compensation against, say, any of the major polluters, such as the United States, for example. And that opinion of the International Court of Justice also stretched further to countries that may have been in the Paris Agreement but no longer are. You know which country I'm referring to. So I would say that the Paris Agreement itself was a moment of international solidarity. It was in a way the manifestation of climate science and policy. It's not the fault of the agreement itself. It did not get implemented vigorously by those who designed it. That might be on the agreement, but I think the agreement itself was a noble effort. But as we've just heard, it was not binding. It was not legally binding. Until we've now had this opinion of the court. So how that, for example, will be pursued in the federal courts of the United States remains to be tested. Yeah, but for me, it's a huge tragedy looking back today, now more than 10 years later, that action did not follow the agreement. Not in terms of mitigation or in terms of adaptation, not nearly at the scale we need. And let me then just finally reflect more on Durban. I think Durban was a tremendous disaster. More than 540 people lost their lives. Durban flood occurs. It can be this argument. And the type of weather system that caused the Durban flood is being intensified by climate change. That is now a well-published result, well-understood result how it works. It's just a matter of time before we have the next mega flood in Durban. So my hope is that the next time when this type of flood strikes, we will have well-coordinated community evacuations. But that means we need to do really a big scale up, a big investment to train hundreds of volunteers to work with the community leaders and to have evacuation plans for all the most flood-prone communities. That's a big job that requires a huge financial investment. And it would be a tragedy if those types of investments are only currently being made to safeguard infrastructure and factories, and not the most vulnerable people themselves. And my hope is that there will be a successful collaboration within what is now known as the Durban Coalition, which brings together civil society, a number of NGOs that really know what they are doing on the ground, non-profit organizations they are, and the city. So I've had personal meetings, I've met in person with many city officials, and many of them are fully on board. One just sometimes get the feeling that they have a feeling of hopelessness themselves if they look at the scale of this issue. 250,000 people below the flood line, and hundreds of thousands of more people living against the hill slopes when the mudslides occur. So this is a cooperation that is needed. And I think what we are seeing at global changes is that at least some of our municipalities are fully on board. And I almost want to make the prediction there's going to be more partnerships between local government, at least in some municipalities, and civil society when it comes to safeguarding people against climate change risks.
Quickly, just add in, I think we were good questions for you, Prof. But yeah, I think I do empathize with everybody in the audience who's spoken about just the importance of our communities and how do we get this to them, how do we make them aware of all of these issues on a broader level and in light of all the other issues that are there. And so yeah, I think this is the work that we have to do from the ground, is working together to think through these issues, to build these solidarities. I'm sure there's people in this room who know a thing or two about a thing or two, and how do we come together and build and do this work together. And so I also think what's been hopeful is just seeing spaces where communities do get together and are able to overcome a challenge or issue that they've come across by coming together. So I think it's been inspiring to see that and to hope that that can happen on a broader scale. And I think even in the book that you have around worker cooperatives, it's inspiring to know that across the world that there are people who are doing the alternative, who are building differently. And so despite the overwhelm, I think we can still have hope in resistance.
I mean, the Phase Out Fossil Fuel Treaty is something the Climate Justice Charter also supports. There's a petition in this exhibition put together by the Wits CJCM students, and there's a QR code. And it's calling on the public to support the April conference in Colombia. And hopefully you'll sign it. The more signatures we get, we're going to demand that the South African government goes to the Colombia conference and supports the Phase Out of Fossil Fuel Treaty. It's a critical moment in the multilateral process. I mean, there were so many questions about the community Malefi. I mean, that links with what Ariel was asking, the colleague at the back. It comes back to what Jessica is saying. We've got to build a mass movement. This exhibition is inviting you to be part of a mass movement. We've got a lot of work to do. And the clock is ticking, basically. And I keep on using this phrase, we've got to own the problem and the solution together. Not one individual, not one organization is going to be able to face this. The final point I'll make is this, is that I don't think that imperial structures, including the private sector, have a handle on this. from what I saw over the past few years on the ground, things are very brittle and fragile. And they can, a double punch can push a whole system down, okay? A system, it could be a water system, it could be a food system, and so on. We are at a very interesting moment where when this challenge becomes even more poignant, power structures are going to loosen because they don't have the wherewithal. The state is not thinking systems. The state is not thinking complexity. The state in this country is not thinking these risks in a serious way, okay? So there's going to be a whole lot of, I don't want to call it chaos, but there's going to be interesting shifts in the society because there's going to be a necessity that's going to come to the fore, the necessity to survive, whether we like it or not, okay? If this country experienced COVID-19 while it was having the drought, we would have had to import food aid in South Africa, simple, because our food system did collapse in different parts of the country, okay? That's the reality that we are facing. This El Nino that's rising might just bring a devastating drought, and it's going to have very, very serious consequences. So these moments are going to reveal the weaknesses, the strengths, the dynamics in society, and so on. And I think what some of us are saying here to you today, let's try and get in front of these problems. Let's start working together. Take those small steps together in our communities, in our workplaces, and let's rise to this challenge. That's going to be the politics that's going to make a difference, nothing else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vish. Francis, Vishwas, and Jessica, thank you very much for the insights that you brought to the room here, as well as the participation of the audience, the observations, the questions, illuminating the subject that we're dealing with today. So thank you very much for the participation. So what I'm going to do now is to invite the curator of the exhibition to do one, vote of thanks. Secondly, guide us to the exhibition. And also to where to buy the book, where we have the snacks, where we drink wine. Before you do that, when you leave, I've got a book there. It must be the first one that you sign. But thank you very much, folks. Much appreciated. Thank you very much.
This exhibition program goes on until May 6th, and thank you to the Audience Center for giving us that space and time. But during this time, we are inviting 250 school children to visit and engage with this exhibition. The costs have been defrayed, and they will have free access. So if any of you are teachers or active on a governance body in a school, or want to get school kids from your community to come, please speak to Jessica when you're having wine and so on. Jessica's here, she's coordinating that program. At least 25 per school should come through. If there's more interest, we'll try and broaden that number. So the more awareness, the better. We had a Facing the Heat Cultural Circle with Molefi and others on Saturday, 7th March. All present shared very thoughtful cultural praxis, and crucial connections were made for ongoing collaboration to raise climate awareness. So this was raised by many people in the room. Culture has a very, very important role around raising climate awareness. So that's part of this program. The other part of the program was of course today, formal opening and launch, and we really hope you enjoy the exhibition. The kind of narrative, think with it. There are three big questions at the heart of it. And then of course hang out with us and chat and talk and so on. There will be a university student facing the heat circle, also hosted in this room. Students from universities in the province are invited to share their experiences of climate extremes, discuss the challenge of transforming universities into climate justice leaders and post-normal institutions. So please, May 6th is what, 2 months away or something? So please ask your friends, families, and comrades to interact with this exhibition. We are going to donate 400 copies of the Facing the Heat book to schools, community, and university libraries, as well as community resource centers and organizations. The way this will be done, it will be convened with users of the library, with communities, to again take them through this book and help people understand. So the challenge of raising awareness is front and center. Proceeds from book sales will be given to the Climate Justice Charter movement to scale up its transformative activism. So please buy the book to support our movement building processes. We need to build a powerful movement. Now, vote of thanks. Firstly, to the many activists fighting for climate justice. They inspired this book, and thank you for your resistance. Sincere appreciation to activists from climate-impacted communities for giving me time and access. The Emancipatory Future Studies Project at Wits University, the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, and the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation enabled the resourcing for this project, which I'm deeply grateful. Charles Simane, Kawakaze Mashlalela, Jane Cherry, Nomaswazi Mtombeni, Jessica Ngwenya, and Simpiwe Msiza from COPAC all provided constructive feedback on the book and the exhibition. I'm sincerely appreciative of Janet Solomon, who's here, who flew up from Durban, for taking me around in the aftermath of the Durban rain bomb, for curation assistance. Special acknowledgements are due to Jessica Ngwenya, who's on this podium, on the stage, Nomaswazi Mtombeni, and Simpiwe Msiza. But a special mention and recognition to Joe Morrison, who's seated right there. Put your hand up, Joe. My research assistant, whose creativity, talent, and mastery of Google tools has certainly imprinted this book and this exhibition. A special thanks to my partner, Michelle Williams, for her unwavering support and who willingly explored many of the unnatural climate disasters cited. A very brave woman, Michelle. We went into floods and so on. Thank you to the custom publishing team at Jacana Media for embracing this project. And finally, thank you to my panelists and moderator, Mandla, and to you all for making the time today to be part of this opening of the Facing the Heat in South Africa exhibition and book launch. So from here, we invite you all to view the exhibition, so please step through that door and you go left. Yeah, right. Sorry, right. Right, and then right again. Right again. So many quirks in this building. And then, of course, enjoy it. Mill around, take it in, and then just step out to the left, the Scotland's room, where we're providing some light meals, some wine, and of course there will be book sales as well. If you want me to sign or anyone else, Michelle and I also have another book there, we'll sign it for you as well. So over to you. Thank you for coming.